Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Hi everybody, my name's Tami and I'm an alcoholic. You know, there's a whole lot of you out there. I'd like to congratulate the chip takers and the birthday people. I kind of want to know what happened to the piano player. It's a story of my life. As soon as I get up, the piano player disappears. That was really entertaining. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was living in a 4,000 square foot home with 3 cars in the garage paid for and a maid on a half an acre of land. And my husband and my 2 kids were living in a 1-bedroom hotel room. That's how bad my drinking had gotten. I had my first drink when I was 13, and that was an abnormal experience from the get-go. My dad was having a business party, and my job as his little 13-year-old daughter was to walk around and carry these flutes of champagne to all his business guests. And about a half an hour before that party started, I got into that champagne. And by the time that party started, I was in my bedroom heaving my guts out. I mean, projectile vomiting. I was sicker than I had ever been sick in my life. But there was something about that alcohol. And even though I was heaving and barfing and all over the place, I kept trying to drink that alcohol. And you know, my bedroom was here at that party, and then the bedroom next door was down the hall where the guests were supposed to check in their coats and their hats and their purses. And I remember in those fragmented flashes, as we do when we're drunk, of my dad's business guests looking into my bedroom and seeing this little 13-year-old girl barfing, I mean heaving my guts out, and they were all saying, "My God, what's wrong with Tami?" And I remember back then in those fragmented flashes at age 13 yelling out, "It's not the alcohol, it's something I ate, I've got the stomach flu." At age 13, I was already defending my king alcohol. How did I know to do that? Why did I do that? I was molested by my dad from age 5 to 15, and I share about that because I want to let you know that that kept me sick for a really long time, because I believe that I had a right to drink alcohol. If you were raised in a house like that and you'd been put in and out of foster care 3 times before age 15, you drink too. And I wore it like a badge of pride, you know, this type of a background. By age 18, the Devonshire Police Division, the West Valley Police Division out in the San Fernando Valley where I live, already knew me by first name, because they'd come to whatever home I was living in with whatever man I was shacking up with at the time. And at age 18, the youngest man that I had lived with was age 52. And they'd come to these homes, because I was a 15-year-old runaway, and that's how I had to survive, by living with older men. And they'd come to these homes where I'd be shacked up with one of these men, and they'd either find me thrown downstairs, my ribs had been cracked, my nose had been broken. One guy took all the clothes and put them into a trash can, and he took kerosene and he poured kerosene all over the clothes and lit a big bonfire and threw them into the pool in the apartment that we lived in. And the police would be called out on these domestic disputes, and they'd come and they'd say, "My God, it's this kid Tami again." At 18, the police department already knew me on a first name basis. It was while I was living with one of these 52-year-old men that I met the man that today is my husband of 11 and a half years, Rick. And I'll never forget, Rick lived down the hall from me in this apartment building, and I was living with this guy that was beating the crap out of me. But you know, in my childhood, I kind of had this funny thing where we had all these atrocities going on at home, and I was in and out of foster cares and all this other garbage. But you know, I was in school, and I was like a cheerleader, and I made straight A's in school, and I started to take this life that I learned early in my, in my earlier years into my early adult life. And I was living with these older men, and I was being passed around from older man to older man, and I was being beaten up, and the police were being called out, yet I was in college, and I was on the dean's list, and I was making straight A's. And the man who is today my husband, Rick, used to, see me living this like totally chaotic life, and yet I'd also be out in the pool for hours studying and writing these papers. And my husband is a surgeon, He's an obstetrician. And I remember I was riding up in the elevator with him one day, and he said, Tammy, can I ask you a question? And I was kind of looking down at the ground the way I always did. And I said, yeah. And he took my face, and he just pulled my chin up to where my eyes had to meet his eyes. And I don't know about you, but prior to coming to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and even today, I have a really hard time sometimes holding someone's gaze, but it's getting a whole lot better. And I remember he said, can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah. And he said, Tammy, were you touched as a little girl the way a little girl shouldn't have been touched when you were growing up? And I felt like I had a friggin' neon sign on my forehead, and I don't know why, but I said, yeah. And you know, like any good alkie, he now had me. And the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous tells us that we have a distorted perception of what's real. And from the minute I told my husband, the man who is today my husband, at this time he wasn't, my secret, I was vulnerable now. He became the enemy because I perceived that he could harm me. And I did the only thing an alcoholic knows how to do when they feel that kind of fear and they don't have a higher power in their life. I had to do one of them control things. And I married him 3 weeks later because I had to own him. He had my secret, and I couldn't let him go. My husband's an Al-Anon. I'm not going to go into all the devastating things I did during the next 8.5 years of that marriage, but that marriage produced 2 children, and I have 2 children today, Chelsea and Alex. And to give you some idea of the type of person that I was when I drank, I remember one day my husband came home, and my drinking had gotten so bad that we literally had my children in childcare all day while my husband was at his office working, seeing patients, and then he'd be out delivering babies all night, and we had to have a person live with us because you could never count on me to be a sober mom or to be there or to be safe or responsible for my children. And my husband, working the hours that he worked, had been up all night delivering babies, and then he went to daycare at 6 o'clock, and he picked up our kids and brought them home, and of course I'd been drinking all day as usual. And we had a 2-story house, and I was perched up on the 2nd story of our house, and my husband pulled into the driveway. And as he pulled into the driveway, he saw me up on the roof, and he kind of walked out of the driveway and looked up on the roof, and I was perched up there, and I just flew off the roof onto his head, and I dug my nails into his eyes while I sat on the top of his head. And my 2 children were 2 and 3 at the time, and they witnessed this whole thing. And while I was digging my nails on his head, he reached up to grab me to get me off of his head, and when he flew his hand up, his ring lacerated and cut my eye, and it caused like a big black eye, like a hematoma on my eye. And I waited till the next day to sober up, and I went down to the Devonshire Police Division, and my husband is an obstetrician. All his patients are women. He had been in practice for 18 years before he ever married me. He is a minority. He did not come from a good background. He put himself through medical school, and I went down to the Devonshire Police Division, and I had my husband arrested with my black eye and my cut for felony battery charges for something he didn't even do. And the police marched into my husband's office with a waiting room full of patients, and they handcuffed him and threw him into jail. That's the way I am when I drink, folks. And he was the only sober parent that my children had. And I was down there, and they were taking shots of my face in all different positions, and I let them do that, knowing full and aware that my husband did not hit me. That's the way I am when I drink alcohol. That's the effect that alcohol has on me. It was soon after I had my husband arrested that he found this Nazi group called Al-Anon. And I can honestly stand here and tell you today that I am grateful to Al-Anon because Al-Anon took away my greatest enabler. I'll never forget, my husband started attending these Nazi meetings, and he came home one day, and I was in my house, and all the windows had been kicked out. I used to like kick out windows and throw things, and all the lights were out, and he came home and immediately ran out of the house, and he called the police one more time. And the police showed up, and they came, and I was sitting in my stairwell, and my hair was out to here, and I was like breathing heavy, and I was like foaming at the mouth, and the police came in, and I remember they flashed a flashlight on me, and I was sitting in the dark on my stairs. And then they flashed a flashlight on a portrait that I had taken with my family 6 years earlier. And the guy said, "Ma'am, is that you in that picture?" And I'm like, "Yeah!" You know, like a Tasmanian devil. And he said, "My God, what happened to you?" You know, and that night my husband went to an Al-Anon meeting, and when he came home, he didn't look down at the ground anymore, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, "Tammy, you can go to a hell in a handbasket if you want to, but you are not taking Chelsea and Alex and I with you anymore." And there was something in his eyes, and I felt that fear that I have always felt, and I did the only thing an alcoholic, again, knows how to do when they feel that fear and they don't have a higher power in their life. I went to the bottle, my higher power. And I went and I bought a huge bottle of vodka, and I got on the 118 freeway. And my last 2 years of drinking, I was so physically sick from alcohol. You know, like I earlier explained, at age 13, my first drink, I was already physically sick to alcohol, vomiting that stuff up. And the last 2 years of drinking, I used to buy a bottle of vodka and I'd stick it on my bathroom counter. Then I'd take a toothbrush with toothpaste and I'd put toothpaste on the toothbrush and I'd lay that on my counter. Then I'd take this shower cap and I'd put my hair up because I always barfed after I drank, and the barf would bounce off the toilet up into my hair. So I had a shower cap to protect my hair. And I had this old sweatshirt of my husband's, and I cut the neck out so that I could throw that sweatshirt on and off my clothes because the barf used to also bounce up on my clothes. And I'd take the bottle and I'd plug my nose and I'd unscrew the bottle, then I'd down that sucker, then I'd quickly screw it back up, not releasing my finger from my nose. Then I'd take the toothbrush and brush my teeth and put it down, and I would let go of my nose and pray that that sucker stayed down long enough so it would explode and go to my brain before I barfed it up. And then I'd always barf it up. And I drink like that the last 2 years of my drinking. If that ain't insane, I don't know what is. You know? So anyway, my husband comes home and he tells me this, and there's something different in his eyes. And I go down to the liquor store and I buy a bottle of vodka and I get on the 118 freeway and I plug my nose and I unscrew that bottle while I'm driving and I pour that sucker down and I hold it down long enough and it explodes in my brain, and then I barfed it up all over myself, and I'm on the 118 freeway and I just take my BMW, man, and I floored it. And you know, I'm one of those obnoxious drunks who, like, after the alcohol starts to take effect, I'd get on the phone. I don't know, you have any phone callers in here? And I'd like call like all these people, and I was on the 118 freeway, and all I remember seeing was this call box, and I decided I was going to make another one of those phone calls, you know. So I take my car and I head it toward that call box, and yeah, boom, and I wrap my BMW around that call box. And I'm thrown into jail one more time. And by this time, I'd been in 7 of those rehabs. You know, they weren't even rehabs. They were nut wards. From age 15 to age, I would say 26, I'd been locked up in 7 of those nut wards. And never once was the diagnosis alcoholism. It was always mental and emotional disorders. I remember I had been diagnosed at 17 as being a sociopath with schizophrenic tendencies. And I used to tell these therapists, you know, that I'd hear voices. And I did hear voices, and the voices used to tell me to drink, and I used to talk back to my head and I'd say, I can't drink, I get too sick, I can't drink. And the therapist would say, well, what would you do with those voices? And I said, well, eventually I'd give in and I'd take a drink. And they said, and then what would happen to the voices? And they'd say, take another drink, you know? And I was describing the phenomenon of craving in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't know what an alcoholic was. I wasn't a schizophrenic. That was the phenomenon of craving. I used to sit with my parents in therapy after therapy after therapy session with my arms folded, and they say I was a sociopath because I appeared to be able to do certain behaviors with no social conscience whatsoever. And I would sit in these groups and they'd go around the circle talking about all these atrocities that I had done, and they'd ask me, don't you have any remorse for any of this stuff? And I'd sit there and go, no, because I didn't remember any of it. I was a blackout drunk. And in therapy they gave me a diagnosis as a sociopath. So by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was a sociopath with schizophrenic tendencies who would live in and out of institutions and be managed through medications, and that was about the best hope that they had for a person like me. So I wrapped my car in this call box on the 118 freeway, and I'm in jail one more time. And the condition of my getting out of jail is I had to go to another one of those fancy treatment centers. And I didn't want to do the time, so I said fine, and they threw me into another one of those treatment centers. And my husband, again, is a physician, and we bought the best doctors that money can buy. And I'm here to tell you, if you want to drink, you can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the right to drink. Because I'd sit in these groups with these teams of the best therapists from UCLA, and I'd tell them, I drink every day. There is probably not a 24-hour period where there is not alcohol in my blood. And they tell me, given the childhood that you had and being that you were molested and brought up in foster care, you are thoughtlessly overserved by liquor store owners and bartenders. This is not your fault. Later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, they had a new name for the effect that alcohol had on me. They called me an alcoholic. In therapy, I used to tell them that I would lay in bed and plot out my own death and think about suicide all the time. In therapy, they told me, given the childhood that I had, I'm clinically depressed and would probably need to be managed through medications for the rest of my life and go in and out of institutions. Later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, they had a new name for a woman, a mother of 2 children that is so selfish, she's willing to take her own life without any consideration whatsoever to how it would affect her husband or 2 kids. They called it alcoholism. Selfishness and self-centeredness. The world revolves around Tami. In therapy, I used to tell them that I'd break into my husband's ATM machines, working the hours that he worked, and I'd take that money and I'd take other men out to fancy restaurants, and I'd buy other men fancy clothes. In therapy, they told me that being that I was raised in foster care, I somehow had lost any material things as a child or had no security in keeping them, and therefore somehow my self-esteem got tied up into material things, so taking this money from my husband was tied up to material things, which was tied up to my self-esteem, and really this wasn't my fault. Later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, they had a new name for that behavior too. They called it stealing. And not only did I steal my husband's hard-earned money, working the hours that he worked, babysitting our 2 small children at home, and buy other men fancy clothes and take other men to fancy restaurants, but I took other men to fancy hotels, and I took other men on fancy vacations. And in therapy, they told me that I was searching for the father that I never had, and that my needs weren't getting met at home by my husband. And later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, they had a new name for that behavior too. They called it cheating. See, by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd been in 7 rehabs, jail 4 times, and paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to therapists to find out that living inside of me was a hurt, wounded inner child that was wounded due to a discontented childhood and the lack of nurturing in my childhood, and that inner child was forcing me to drink against my own will, and none of this was my fault. And then I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and they threw my butt up against the wall, and they said, "No, baby, you're a liar, you're a cheat, you're a thief, and you're an alcoholic suffering from alcoholism." And it's the first time I heard the truth about me in 30-something years. So I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I did not change my behavior. And God loved the women in Alcoholics Anonymous. They said, "Tami, stay away from those clubhouses, little girl. Those men are going to eat you alive." And I want to let y'all know that when I quit wearing the low-cut titty tops and the high-cut shorts and sitting on the guys' laps, I didn't have a problem with the men in clubhouses anymore. But I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I refused to change my behavior. I came to meetings late. I left meetings early. I sat on the guys' laps. I picked up men out in parking lots. And needless to say, I took 5 of those 30-day chips. But I remember my last drink really well after the drink, because I stood at a podium like this, and I'd taken my 5th 30-day chip, and I told you all something about God and how wonderful my life was while I was wearing one of those low-cut titty tops and high-cut shorts. And as soon as I took my chip, I went trolling on out to that parking lot, and someone came out and said, "Tami, you have a call on the payphone." And I went in and I took the call, and it was my husband. And I hadn't seen my husband or children in 66 days because they were living in a hotel room. And my husband said to me, "Tami, are you sober?" And I said, "Yes, in fact, I've taken another one of those 30-day chips." And he said, "Tami, our 4-year-old son Alex is playing t-ball, and if you're sober, the kids would like you to come and watch him play." And I told him that I'd like that. And I took the directions, and I drove down to this little league field. And when I got there was this man as I was parking, and he was like in this screaming match with his wife. I mean, he was just like going at it with her, and he had all the veins popping out of his head and out of his neck, and she's crying, and they're just blah, blah, blah. So I walked past them, and all of a sudden I look up, and there was my 4-year-old son, and he was up at bat. And my little 6-year-old daughter was in the bleachers eating a snow cone. And my husband was wearing a team uniform, and they were having fun. And one more time, I felt that fear that we feel when we have no higher power in our lives, that I was losing, that Al-Anon was teaching my husband how to go on with his life without me, and my alcoholism wasn't affecting them anymore. I had the 2-story house. I had the 3 cars in the garage. I had the maid on a half an acre of land. They were living in a hotel room, and they were having fun. And I felt that fear again. And I just walked away from this scene, and they didn't even look up other than to just wave, and then they went on playing. And I walked past that same guy who was in that screaming match in the parking lot with his wife, and he's kicked back, basting in the sun with a cooler in front of him, looking totally relaxed. And I just looked at him and I go, man, you look like you're feeling better. And he said, yeah, babe, nothing a beer wouldn't cure. You want one? 7 rehabs, jail 4 times, in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous. My husband and kids were living in a hotel room. And I said, yeah. And I don't know what that dude's night was like, but I came to 4 days later in this woman's kitchen in Inglewood. And I didn't know how I got from Inglewood, from the San Fernando Valley down to Inglewood. And I had this huge cut across my eye, and I had a big gash across my head. I had urinated on myself. I had barfed on myself. And I'm struck sober in this woman's kitchen, and she's giving my husband directions to come and pick me up one more time. And my husband drove down to Inglewood, and he opened up the car door, and I got in. And he said, Tami, the kids and I have moved back into the house on this last run of yours, and I have a restraining order on you, and it says that you cannot come within 1,700 feet of our 2 kids, of me, or of our home, and you gotta go. And that's all he said in that 45-minute period. And I said, Rick, where am I going to go? And he said, I don't know, Tami, but you got to go. And I knew that I had to go. And I felt a rage fill up inside of me that I had never felt before in my life. I hated Alcoholics Anonymous. I hated Al-Anon. I hated those therapists. I hated my childhood. I hated my kids. I hated the whole world for my behavior one more time. And I went into my home, and I gathered up my stuff, and I turned to my husband, and I said, let me just say goodbye to the kids before I go. It hasn't been that long ago yet. And I walked into my 4-year-old son's bedroom while he was asleep in his bunk bed. And I just took my finger and I outlined his little heart-shaped lips while he was asleep. And he opened up his eyes and he goes, Mom, why are you doing this to us? And in that instant, something happened. I became willing to do whatever it took. I never wanted to drink alcohol again. And everything that you people had shared in those 5 months that I came in and out of those rooms wearing the low-cut tops and the high-cut shorts and sat on the guys' laps went zooming through my head. Rarely have we seen a person fail who thoroughly follows our path. Change your behavior and the whole world will change around you. Surrender to win. And I knew that I could do it. I knew it was not my husband. It was not the therapist. It was not my childhood. It was that goddamn alcohol. It had always been about the alcohol. Everything that had ever gone wrong in my life was around that alcohol. And I knew it like I'm standing here today. And it wasn't only an emotional and a physical spiritual surrender, it was a physical one. Because I collapsed on my son's room and I looked up and I said, oh my God, please help me. And I knew that I could have the hope that those people shared in those rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I never wanted to drink again. And I packed up my stuff and I left that night. And I went down to my local clubhouse called the Hole in the Sky in Canoga Park. And there was a guy named Jerry Green. I don't know if some of you may know him. He's since passed on. But he used to park his van in the back of the Hole in the Sky, and he'd let people who didn't have a place to stay for a couple of nights sleep in his van. And here I am, a doctor's wife, well-educated, living in a 2-story house with a maid. And I went down and I slept in Jerry Green's van that night, and I don't think I ever felt more at peace than I did that night. I laid in that van and I took in a deep breath and I just went, and it's the first time I had breathed in 8.5 years. And I knew that the battle was over, and I couldn't wait for the next day for the Hole in the Sky to open up because I knew the battle was over. And I laid in that van that night, and I remember that there was a late night meeting, and there was a whole bunch of people talking. And as the night grew deeper into the night, it just got quieter and quieter, and I just remember the lights in the parking lot flashing down on that van. And I didn't sleep that whole night, but I felt a peace that I had never felt. And I woke up the next morning, and there's this mean old cowboy named Nick down at the Hole in the Sky, and Nick just celebrated his 34th year of sobriety. And Nick was the manager of the Hole in the Sky, and Nick used to tell his babies, stay the hell away from that blonde girl Tami, she's bad news. And Nick opened up the hole in the sky at 8 o'clock, and there was a hose in the restaurant behind the hole in the sky. And I went and I washed up my face and hands, and I walked into the hole in the sky. And I used to try to talk to Nick in those 5 months that I used to walk in and out and try to pick up on all his babies. And whenever I tried to talk to him, he'd just read a paper and he'd never look up. He wouldn't even give me the time of day. And I stood at the end of the coffee bar and I said, Nick, I am willing to do whatever it takes. I never want to drink again. And he turned and he put his paper down for the first time and he looked me in the eye and he said, so why'd you drink this time, Tammy? And I said, Nick, I'm clinically depressed. And he said, depressed? And he said, Tammy, when's the last goddamn time you have ever done anything nice for anyone else? And I went to go fight, before that final surrender, and I went, and the words came out. And I said, I don't know, Nick, but I'm willing to try. And he said, see that guy named Arthur over there mopping the floors? And there was this big old guy, Arthur, and it was 8 in the morning, and he was already mopping the floors of our clubhouse. And I said, yeah. And he said, why don't you go help him? And I don't know why, but I went over and I grabbed that mop. And it was the first time I took one of those actions, one of those stupid, idiotic AA actions that I didn't understand. Shake the speaker's hand, make the coffee, mop the floors. I used to think it was the dumbest thing in the world. And I went over and I grabbed that mop. And I know for a fact that the day that I grabbed that mop is the day that I crossed from the dying into the living, because I took one of those stupid AA actions. I always wanted to know why your program worked. I never cared about how it worked. And I took that mop and I mopped those floors. And I don't know why, but I felt better. And I walked over to Nick when I was done and he was engaged in a pinochle game, and I plopped down my mop and I turned to Nick and I said, Nick, I'm done mopping the floors. And I thought he was going to get up and give me a big hug and pat me on the back, and he turned and he goes, you missed a spot, And that's the kind of love I got in Alcoholics Anonymous. And still get. Enabling compassion will kill you if you're an alcoholic of my type. They have a joke down at the hole in the sky that Nick's always prying his cowboy boot out of my rear end, because at every opportunity, I'm always screwing something up, but you know what? I don't drink. And that's the one thing I don't do wrong, and I adore Nick. 365 days after I grabbed that mop, I walked back into the hole in the sky, and my table looked like a florist shop, and there were 11 members of Al-Anon there with my husband, and the room started to sing Happy Birthday to Me. And I walked up to the front of that room, and there was a cake with one candle on it, and on the other side of that candle was my 6-year-old daughter, Chelsea. And I told you people all year that I believed that I was an alcoholic. And I told you people that I believed in a God. But when I looked at that flame flickering between my daughter and I heard that room singing Happy Birthday to Me, I knew that there was a God that day. His amazing grace. I had gone 365 days without a drink. And I took in a deep breath and I blew out that candle. And I looked up and my husband Rick was holding that cake and tears were rolling down his eyes. And I knew that there was a God that day. That mean old cowboy named Nick also came up, and he gave me a huge bouquet of flowers, and he kissed me on the top of the head, and he said, I'll see you next year, kid. And I knew that he would, and he did. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Nick. Nick is my mentor in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I don't know why, but I was able to hear it from Nick. And I didn't trust a whole lot of people my first few years in Alcoholics Anonymous, but I trusted Nick. And everywhere Nick went to speak, I'd follow him. If I knew he was speaking, I'd find out where he was speaking, and I'd get there before, and I traded in my low-cut tops and my high-cut shorts for dresses and sandals and skirts. And I'd be a greeter at every meeting I knew he was going to speak at. And they used to call me like the AA groupie, I was really obnoxious. I was kind of like stink on crap. Wherever Nick went, I was, and it was really obnoxious. But I really, really believed in him, because I could see that he cared more about my life and my sobriety than he did about my feelings, and he was always willing to tell me the truth. And for the longest time, I wanted Nick to sponsor me because he was the only person I trusted. And and I go, Nick, will you be my sponsor? And he'd say, Tammy, I won't sponsor you. And I go, Nick, we've taken the steps together. I travel with you everywhere. I talk to you 5 times a day. All my commitments are at every meeting you're at. Why won't you be my sponsor? And he'd say, Tammy, I won't sponsor you. And one day I think I had about 4 months of sobriety, and he was at the Hole in the Sky, and he was in his office, and I walked into his office, and I took my top and I lifted it up and I go, Nick, aren't these pretty? Now will you be my sponsor? And in front of God and the Hole in the Sky, man, he kicked me out of his office and he said, God damn it, Tami, that's why I won't be your sponsor. Go get a woman sponsor, you know? And I got a woman sponsor. And Diana is a good sponsor. Diana is sober. Diana participates all the time in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Diana took me through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Diane not only sponsors with her words, but she sponsors with her actions, because from what I can see, this woman incorporates the principles and the 12 steps of this program into her daily living. And I'm up at CSUN right now just finishing a bachelor's degree, and Diana's in pre-med. And for some reason, we ended up in the same math department this year. And I like to think that my higher power has something to do with that, because I'm back in that big bad world out there with people who aren't like us. And every day at 11 o'clock, Diana and I get out of our math class. We're both taking calculus, and we walk down and we see each other, and she just gives me a wink or a little smile, and that really centers me. And Diane always returns my phone calls, and I can't ask for a better sponsor than Diane, and I absolutely adore her. Like I said, I sobered up at the Hole in the Sky, and I am really proud to be a sober member of the Hole in the Sky, because we get to do those things called 12-step calls. And for those of you that are newer, a 12-step call is when a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous gets the opportunity to go and carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the message of hope, to someone who's still battling with the bottle, that they don't have to live that way anymore. And you know, for the longest time, I didn't want to do 12-step calls. And you know, you hang around Nick for any amount of time, and you're going to do 12-step calls whether you like them or not. You know, you don't get asked whether you want to go on one. You're just told that you're going. And I remember I was down at Radford, and I was sharing one day, I think I had about 4 or 5 months of sobriety, and I was sharing about my husband. And I was saying, you know, God, jail 4 times and 7 rehabs, quite frankly, I think he overreacted. And I was really upset about this restraining order. You know, because damn it, I had 4 months of sobriety now, and I wanted that restraining order lifted. And you know, these old-timers, they really know. You know, if you don't like the old-timers in Alcoholics Anonymous, don't worry, you'll never be one. You know? How smart this old-timer woman was. She hears me in there sniveling and whining about my husband, and she walks up to me, and she'd been sponsored by Alabama Carruthers. And I don't know if everybody that talks like this got sponsored by Alabama Carruthers, or everybody that, or Alabama Carruthers sponsors everybody that talks like this, but she walks up to me and she goes, darling, one day I'm going to have a 12-step call for you, and I'd like your phone number. And I thought, oh God, you know, the last bloody thing I want to do is go talk to some drunk. But I reluctantly gave her my phone number, and I didn't hear from that woman for 4 months. But I went down to the Hole in the Sky every day, and I mopped those floors, and I made coffee, and I followed Nick, and I'd hear about 12-step call this and 12-step call that, and I was starting to feel like I wasn't a part of it because I'd never been on one of these calls. And 4 months go by, and my phone rings, and I pick up the phone, and I hear, darling? And I go, oh God. And she goes, are you sober? And I said, yes, ma'am, I am. And now I've got 8 or 9 months of sobriety, and I'm coming up on a birthday, and I want to be a good AA and do the right thing. And she goes, I got that 12-step call for you. And she gives me this address down in North Hollywood. So I get in my car, and I drive down to North Hollywood, and when I get there, there's like 4 or 5 police cars outside of this apartment building. And there's this like big crowd of people, and they're carrying this woman out like a piece of meat. She's just swinging, and one officer has this arm, and the other officer has this arm, and one's got each foot, and she's kicking and screaming and yelling. And I turned to this woman, Yvonne, and I said, Yvonne, I really appreciate you calling me on this thing, but it looks like everything's kind of handled here. She goes, no, baby, your job's right in there. And I walked into an apartment, and there were 3 kids underneath a coffee table, and they'd been on a steady diet of potato chips and ketchup for 3 days. And my job on that 12-step call was to pull this little boy Kevin out from underneath that coffee table, and he was 4 years old, the same age as my son. And every time his mother screamed. He'd crawl up my neck like a little scared kitten, and I left that 12-step call with bleeding marks going down my neck. And you know, I drove home that night, and I make light of it, but my husband and I barely spoke our first year. I had a restraining order on me until I was 6 months sober, and then we moved back together, and we barely spoke. I mean, every night that we went to bed, it was like sleeping with the enemy. And I came home from that 12-step call, and my husband was asleep in bed, and he never looked better to me than he did that night, because I understood why my husband had called the police all those times and had me locked up, because I was a blackout drunk, and my kids were those kids underneath that coffee table many, many times. And you know, 12-step calls will give you a chance sober, in a sober state of mind, to see what the hell alcohol does to an alcoholic. And more importantly, they'll give you a chance in a sober state of mind to see what the hell an alcoholic does to the people they love. And I highly recommend 12-step calls. You know, we do them all the time, and they're a lot of fun. Just recently, Nick and I went on this 12-step call, and this woman thought she was Calamity Jane, you know, and she's walking with her guns, you know, and she walks in the hole in this guy. And these old-timers, man, they don't miss a beat. They didn't even know we'd brought her in from a 12-step call, and she walks in with her guns in her holsters, and she puts her little toy gun down on the counter, and she turns to this guy, Don, and she says, "Cowboy, buy me a drink." And he didn't even look up at her, and he says, "Darling, the woman at the end of the bars cleaned me out, and I'm milked for the night," you know, and I'm just looking at these guys, and like about 10 minutes later, this woman walks in, and she says, "Tam, you bring her in on a 12-step call?" And I said, "Yeah," and she says, "Hon, I need to tell you something. I 12-stepped that woman a year and a half ago, and she seizured on us, and they called 3 code greens in the hospital, and they almost lost her." And I go, "Ooh, shoot." So I turn over to Nick, and I go, "Nick, this woman seizures." And he goes, "Is that right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "We need to get her to a medical facility." And so we get her in the car, and we make arrangements to get her admitted into this place, and we're driving, and now she's starting to get really sick. And as we're driving, she's taking my hands while I'm driving, and she's going, "Ah, ah, ah," and she's grabbing my hands, and I'm like swerving my car, and I'm looking at Nick, and all of a sudden I just slammed on my brakes, and I said, "Let me tell you something." I said, "We are taking you to a hospital whether you like it or not, and you got 2 choices, darling. If you walk in there like an alcoholic and you just walk a little stupid and slur your words, they're going to put you on the drunk side, and by tomorrow we will probably be visiting you and bringing you cigarettes. But if you continue to act like a maniac like this, they're going to throw you in the rubber room for 2 weeks, and you're going to have no visitors and no cigarettes." And she goes, "Okay, cool." You know? One alcoholic talking to another. We know. I used to play that game. I used to pick bugs off the walls because it would get me attention. I never once saw a bug on a wall, but I would do that when I was locked up. You probably got a pretty good indication that I was a violent drunk when I drank, and I was. And my husband shares about this in Al-Anon, but after I became sober, we developed a domestic violence problem in our home, and my husband started to hit me. And by this time, I had been married to him for 8.5 years, and he had never once laid a hand on me the entire time that we drank. I used to break all the windows in the whole house, but he used to just leave with the kids. And we developed a serious domestic violence problem in our home. And God knows why, but I went back to those therapists, and they told me, "Tammy, your husband has become a wife beater, and once they start, they don't stop. You need to get a restraining order on him, get those 2 kids, get the hell out of there." My husband went to his therapist, and his therapist said, "Rick, your wife was a nutcase when she was drunk. She is a nutcase sober. Get a restraining order on her, get the kids, and get the hell out of there." And thank God, one more time, we went to the people who can help us. Because my husband went down to Al-Anon, and to this day, I do not know what those people told him. But I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I told Nick, and I said, "Nick, I don't understand. All he ever wanted me to do was to become sober, and I'm sober, and now he's beating the crap out of me, and I don't understand it." And man, Nick didn't miss a beat. He said, "Tammy, tell me what happens when you 2 get into these altercations." And I said, "Nick, we get into a discussion, and it starts to get heated, and he walks out on me." And he goes, "Tammy, what do you do?" And I go, "Nick, I go after him. He gets in his car, and I take the 7-Up cans in the garage, and I take the cans, and I'm flying him at his car, and I'm trying to break his window, and if he closes the garage door, I get in my car, and I race down the street, and I try to cut him off." This is in sobriety, folks. And Nick said, Tammy, you're the wife beater in your family. He said, babe, you have lived your whole life in chaos, and you don't know what it's like to lead a serene and sober life. And I venture to guess, darling, that if the next time this happens, you get on the phone and you call a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you will not have a domestic violence problem in your home anymore, and we don't. And thank God we went to the people who understood something about us. And I'll tell you, that first 2 years of picking up the phone when I was like heated, I mean, I'd be like, but I'd pick up the phone and I'd call a sober member, and never once did I have to get hit again. And those therapists would have had us divorced. And divorce is a pretty heavy price to pay to families and children, especially my kids, because they lived through a lot of my drinking. Nick always tells me that I'm not in a meeting to save my butt today. God and I have probably already decided that I'm not going to drink today. I'm in a meeting to save my butt 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, 30 years down the road when it's fallen off. And there might have been something in that meeting that I heard that could save my life. And I never understood what he meant when he said that. And I remember, I had about a year and a half of sobriety, and there was this guy named Ziggy. And he got up to the podium and he said, you don't ever have to drink again if you don't want to, and even if you do. And I remember I was at a meeting, and this woman came up to me after the meeting, and she said, Tammy, I'm scared. I want to drink. I'm going to a wedding. I cannot stop thinking about it. I can taste the alcohol in my mouth. And I said, I'll tell you what, I have plans to take my kids to the beach today, but if you really don't want to pick up that drink, you meet me at Zuma Beach Lifeguard Station like 7 or whatever, and you can spend the whole day with me, and you don't have to take that drink. And I drove down to the beach with my kids, and about a half an hour later, that girl showed up. And we talked that drink all the way through the way you taught me to do in Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the time she was done sharing, she wasn't going to take that drink, and she felt better, and she gave me a hug, and she said thanks, and she got into her car, and in 1 minute my mind went champagne. And within 2 minutes I could feel those effervescent bubbles going up my nose and going down my throat, and I could feel that light buzz. And I always told myself after taking that year cake and having my daughter and my husband give me that cake that I'm never going to have to drink again, because all I have to do is look deep into the eyes of my 2 children, and that will be a strong enough power to keep me from drinking. And I looked at those 2 kids frolicking on the beach in their innocence and their beauty. I said, I don't give a crap about those kids. I want to drink again. And then I knew that the program of Alcoholics Anonymous worked, because I had $3.80 in my pocket, and I wondered if that $1.99 champagne was still $1.99. And I got into my car and I grabbed the steering wheel and I said, God, please help me. And the next thought that went zooming through my head as loud as it could be was something I had heard back when I was a year and a half sober, and it was Ziggy saying, you don't ever have to drink again if you don't want to, and even if you do. And I wanted to drink, and Ziggy told me that I didn't have to. And the next thought that went through my head is take a quarter out of that $3.80 and call Nick. And I called Nick, and he didn't say, you're not working your program, or what step didn't you work, or you're not spiritually fit. 34 years of sobriety, and he said, kid, I thought the same thought about a week ago about scotch. Call someone else. And I called a woman named Beverly Douglas, and she said, kid, you have a disease, you can talk to death, keep talking. And for 3 days, I could not get the thought of that drink out of my head. But I have found that Alcoholics Anonymous will do for me what a drink does, but it takes longer. I have to go to these dumb meetings, I have to shake the speaker's hand, I have to mop the floors, I have to make the coffee, but Alcoholics Anonymous will take away that screaming madness that comes up inside of me when I want to drink. And they took me on a whole bunch of 12-step calls, and they sat my butt down at central office, and those old timers went out of their way, man, and they will. If you want to go to a hell in a handbasket, you can go on your own, but if you want to help yourself, they'll be there with you. And it was during that time I told my husband that I was really thinking strongly about drinking, that I was scared, and that I was just going to have to disappear and go to a lot of meetings and do a lot of 12-step calls. And fortunately, because of Al-Anon, my husband understood that, and he never once questioned it. But one morning during this period, I walked into the bathroom, and my husband was down on his knees, and he was praying. And the arrogance of an alcoholic, I said, Rick, I'm thinking about drinking, but I'm going to be okay, and I'm taking the right actions, and it's so sweet that you're praying for me not to drink. And he got up and he looked me in the eye, and he said, Tammy, I'm not praying for you not to drink. I'm praying for the willingness to leave your butt when you do. And I was... Al-Anon. I figured he hung with me for 8.5 years. If I ever drank, I'd disappoint a few people in AA, but I'd always have my husband Rick. And Al-Anon saw fit that wouldn't be the case. I'd like to thank you all for having me come and share. I'd like to welcome the chip takers and the cake and the girl with less than 30 days. Welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd like to thank Mike for having me. I thank Alcoholics Anonymous for God, and more importantly, I thank God for Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.